Hi there everyone, it's Joe. Welcome back to my channel. And at the moment, the hot topic in FFTCG is very much mono ice. So, mono ice has been doing very well in a lot of Western tournaments, and I wanted to make a video that is going to kind of give you guys some ideas on how to beat mono ice so that you guys don't just sit there and scream doom and gloom going, it's broken, this needs banning, that needs banning, this needs limiting, this game needs to change, blah 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 blah. What I like to do is try and think of ways to actively counter these things and, you know, try and build around like the meta, as it were, because, you know, there's always a way to counter things. But that video is not going to be this video what we're doing right now. This one is going to be a deck that is going to be designed in order to counter a lot of what mono ice does. And, you know, this deck hasn't had an awful lot of testing, but the theory behind it is that it is designed in order to kind of counter the discard element of mono ice by having cheap forwards that can give you advantage, while having powerful units that can deliver a finishing blow. And it's also returning a favourite card of mine back from Opus 1, or a favourite card from everyone's back from Opus 1, and it also has a lot of countermeasures to the dull and freeze mechanic that ice does in and of itself. The other reason that I really like this deck is that it's a colour combination that I've played, you know, myself quite heavily, and it's two of my favourite colours in the game, which is Earth and Water. Earth naturally has a lot of countermeasures to Ice, such as Guy, Yang, Black Mage, and Water also has a lot of countermeasures to it by way of things like Ash and Astrologian. That's all designed to counter dull and freeze mechanics, but you also have ways of dealing with a lot of other stuff in this deck as well. So without further ado, we're just going to go straight into it. Now, the first thing that you'll notice when looking at this deck, particularly in the forward lineup, is that it has quite a large standard unit package by way of things like Pugilist, Psycom Warden, Psycom Enforcer, and Viking. Now, one of the things that at least Viking and Psycom Warden have in common is the ability to search up more copies themselves or draw cards. It actively counteracts a lot of things that discard does. The best way to counter discard is to draw more. So if you're pressing the advantage much in the way that Thaumaturge would discard cards from your hand by having a body on the board, you can then play a Viking to match it, and you'll actually end up with a greater advantage than they will, because you're drawing a card for playing it, you have a body to counteract the Thaumaturge as long as you've got the cards in hand, and then you've also got, you know, the extra draw when he dies as well. And then with gladiators and things like that, you can start pulling them back, you can keep drawing and building your card advantage up. Psycom Warden gets bigger for every copy of itself that you have, and then Pugilist gets bigger for every copy of every standard unit card you have, so there's no reason not to run that here as well. Psycho Enforcer is, as a one-off, is a really cool like counterplay to a lot of monster decks, because things like Tomberries, it forces the activation. A lot of the forwards that turn, a lot of monsters that turn into forwards, like Kobold Droid Yin, which can be a problem, are easily dealt with Psycho Enforcer. But I think that one of it's fine just because you have Bran to search it out of your deck and Gladiator to grab it out of your bin, so you shouldn't need to be blowing up that many monsters in order for that to be relevant, really. My other favourite interaction in this deck is actually something that I was inspired by having watched it during UK Nationals, for which I was doing the commentary on stream for, and it was great fun, so I hope you guys did tune into that when it was on. But it's the combination of Wall and Tidus. Now, Tidus is a card that, since Opus 1, like, everyone was like, oh my god, this card's so amazing, but no one could quite work out how to get it to work unless they were playing Water Wind and using Aerith to stop it so that EX bursts couldn't target him. Well, we have a new card that can kind of do that now in Wall. And Wall has so many uses in this deck, it's crazy, just like every deck that he's in. But with Tidus, you can give him Brave so that you can poke the one time, and then you can know for sure whether you're safe to activate his S ability, Blitz Ace, so you can just keep going. Or you can make it so he's immune to EX bursts, which makes its biggest weakness, you know, null and void. Or you can make him bigger, and there's just lots of nice little interactions that you have with Tidus and a lot of the other cards in this deck as well that make Wall like an all-star player. So, and the fact that you have all these standard units like Viking and Psycom Wardens and stuff like that that just continually build advantage mean that Tidus gets very big very quickly. And then by being supported by things like Pugilist, it actually works out that your board is huge. And I was very inspired by the deck. It's very similar to this one, but I wanted to focus more on how to counter Ice effectively with this deck. That I wanted to focus more on cards like Tidus and like Viking and things like that, just to keep pushing an advantage. Ashes is also in this deck because of how well she counters, well, most things, to be honest. I decided not to put Wrestler in this deck, but there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't put him in there. But if you are going to play Wrestler, I would suggest playing 3 Ash instead of the 2 that I have here, because her S ability is not that often used. It's more a case if you want Ash on the board at all times, and, you know, 2 of them you're often going to be able to do that. But it's very hard to use dull and freeze mechanics on her because she can reactivate herself through her own ability. Mono Lightning can't really deal with her very well because Ousted combo makes her too big to be able to get killed by it. She's just a great anti-meta card in all aspects, so honestly, if you're running a water deck, at this point in time, with Ice being as rampant as it is, and with so many, you know, mechanics that like target her, being rendered null and void, there's not very many reasons not to run Ash, to be quite honest. And then we have a Camlanaut in here, purely because in any mono-coloured matchup, if you can play a Camlanaut down quickly, and it stick for a turn, they're really going to struggle with it. And Ice in particular is really going to struggle with it because Ice doesn't really have an awful lot of methods of outright removing a forward. So in order to beat Ice effectively, you need to get your board established just faster than they can. So there's a lot of cheap costing forwards, there's a lot of cards that like retain advantage when you play them, Camlanaut being one of those cards. You know, you can always search up a Chaos if you need it. Then, you know, you're just establishing your board as quickly as you can, but I didn't want to delve too heavily into it, so there's only one Camlanaut here, because I thought it would just be a really good tech against any mono-coloured deck. Rounding out the forwards are copies of Cecil, Rauban, and Gipple. Gipple I wanted to put in the deck because when you've got all these guys sitting there on the board, that last finishing blow of sitting there going, okay, I'm going to play a Gipple and I'm going to run at you, is a really good play. In honesty, if there were any card in this lineup that you probably could remove first, it probably could be him, because a Viking isn't necessarily going to get big enough to really worry about Gipple being boosting him for you. But I really like the idea of having an overrun when you've got such a big board establishment there. And then you have Rauban and Cecil, who combo very well with one another, but quite honestly, they work very well in of their own rights. Rauban being just a removal spell is just really useful. If you find that there's a problematic card on the board that you want to deal with, then Rauban does it really well. And then Cecil, similarly, makes your guys bigger, but you know, the immunity to damage is really helpful, so you want to have that available as often as you can. If you obviously get Cecil and Rauban out at the same time, then it means that Rauban doesn't die to his own effect, and then, you know, you're just quids in. Rauban also combos really well with Hecaton Care from Opus 4, because if you cast Hecaton in response to Rauban's effect, you effectively get to remove 2 forwards for the price of 1, and that's a pretty big deal. Moving into the backups now. Now the backups in this deck are a little bit murky still, so if you guys have any suggestions on how you'd like to change these up, then by all means feel free to leave a comment. But I figured that 2 copies of Astrologian was pretty much a dead cert in water at the moment, because Ice is so prevalent and it's doing so well, you kind of need to bear it in mind. One of the most important things about defeating a meta is acknowledging that it exists. And to be honest, activating a forward is just useful anyway, because it means that you can attack with a forward, and then, you know, if you need to still block with it, then it's really useful to be able to do that. And then Ash not being the only thing that can do it to itself is really useful. And then we have a copy of Chaos because it goes well with Camlanaut, because honestly, having a forward searcher backup is useful at all times. And then we have 3 copies of Gladiator and 2 copies of Monk. Gladiator is kind of an obvious pick here because, you know, being able to pull back Vikings from your break zone at any time, having a forward backup that can break itself in order to make room for others, all while generating more advantage, is always going to be useful. And in the worst case scenario, you can be pulling back a Pugilist as a power play just because you're getting a massive guy if you've already got guys on the board. So if you've got nobody on the board, then you pull out a Viking. If you're facing against a monster deck, then you obviously pull out Cycle Enforcer. If you're coming up, if you've already established some Cyclone Wardens or Vikings, then you pull back a Pugilist. It's just a really useful card all around. And then Monk, I just wanted a really solid 2 CP Earth backup at all times. There's plenty of other options for this. If you really hate Ice that much, you could run Opus 4 Black Mage, but I think with Astrologian and Ash in the deck, you don't really need to put all your eggs in that one basket. Then you've also got Doga, which if lightning is a real issue for you, you might want to consider doing that, or even against you know, opposing Earth decks that run a lot of cards like Masked Woman, or, you know, Deleter from Opus 4 that like to break your guys. Deleter from Opus 4 could actually work really well in this deck, in all fairness, because if you're in a meta where a lot of 3 CP cards get played, like Lock, then you could always play that and you could break your Viking to then break their Lock, for example, and you're drawing cards out of it, and then him and Wall go very well together, and it just, you know, you've got a lot of malleability with Deleter, so that's something that you might want to consider. And then moving into further backups, we have Bran, obviously as an EX burst searcher for any of the standard units in the deck, particularly useful if you're against a monster deck and you want to search up that 1 copy of Psycom Enforcer. And then you've got Minwu as a one-off because, again, it's like an anti-meta play. There's a lot of like little chip damages that get dealt, so things like Sellers and, you know, this is just ice as well. You also have like Doom Train or Glacial Abolus that does 7k damage. I mean, it's going to remove a lot of the cards in this deck, but most of those cards are going to be cards that you can easily retrieve with Gladiator, or they've already kind of done their job when they've come in. Otherwise, you know, they're too big. They're too big for Glacial Abolus to kill, and therefore Minwu makes it so that no combination plays can be made against them. And then we have Miner, because Miner is just a useful card all around, but in this deck in particular, being able to pull out extra copies of Tidus is particularly strong, because the problem we always had with Tidus back in the day when he was around in Opus 1 was the fact that once you've used him once, because there's only 3 copies in the deck, chances are you're probably not going to get to use him again. This says otherwise. It means that you can pull copies of him out of your break zone so that you can use him at any time. And because of the timing and it being an activate ability, you can do that at literally any time you want. And then finally we have copies of Star Sibyl and Shantotto. Shantotto is just a great card all around. If you're on a back foot, then Shantotto will save you. And if your opponent has managed to outpace you, then you have a way to deal with that. And Star Sibyl can search up either Shantotto or Camlanaut, and it can also cheat in your Camlanauts or your Cecils or any of the 4-drops that you have in the deck if you really wanted to. You could probably take Star Sibyl out if you wanted to for a cheaper costing Earth backup, like any of the ones that I've already mentioned, or more copy, the 3rd copy of Monk, or there's all sorts of things you could do. But I thought that being able to search up Shantotto was actually really very useful. Now the summons in this deck are primarily geared towards retaining advantage. So there's a single copy of Carbuncle in here because a lot of the cards that you have in the deck are very, very small. So your Psycon Wardens, as long as you've got 2 of them there, you'll still be able to, instead of 3, you'll still be able to pull Carbuncle back to your hand. It allows you a way of making Ash bigger than she needs to be in order to kind of like be able to pull it back. And if your opponent then wastes resources on targeting Ash with something bigger to make her big enough so the Carbuncle doesn't go back to your hand, then that's fine because they've used their resources. And you should be able to see whether you're safe to use Carbuncle on Ash or not. But generally speaking, a lot of Ice's plays in particular tend to come into play effects, so you'll have already known whether they were going to happen or not. And then you've also got, your Psycom Enforcer will benefit from it. Your Vikings even might benefit from it if you've played a Gipple or, Wall. I think it's just all combinations of things. Carbuncle could be dropped for something like Titan or Leviathan. I'm not a big fan of Leviathan in the meta right now, purely because, like I said, a lot of Ice's plays, come into play effects. So really, you don't necessarily want to be using Leviathan on anything ice related very much. But there's plenty of other summons that you could use in its stead. However, I think that Fairy is very, very important right now, primarily because, yes, we already have Astrologian and Ash in the deck, but you can't see a Fairy in your opponent's hand, and it does both of the things that Ice doesn't want you to do. It doesn't want you to activate your forwards, and it doesn't want you drawing cards. So if you end up hitting it with an EX burst, it literally just does everything for you that you would want it to. And I think the Fairy is generally quite a good card anyway, because by attacking, it lulls your opponent into a false sense of security. So if they then go and attack you, and then you activate one of your forwards and draw a card for the trouble, you're then blocking something that they weren't expecting, and then you never know when that might help you. And then we have both copies of Hekaton. One of them is just a straight removal piece, which is the Opus 4 Hekaton, and then Opus 1, I honestly believe, is still a great card to this day. Against Ice, the chances are the ones that you're going to be wanting to target are Devout if they're playing it, Duke Larg if they're playing it, which they more than likely are, especially if it's mono Ice, because I think that lowering the power of Ice's forwards is a massive play, because a 7k Genesis is a lot easier to deal with than an 8k one, a 7k Lock is a lot easier to deal with than an 8k one, an 8k Sellers is a lot easier to deal with than a 9k one, and the list goes on. That 1000 power can make a lot of difference. And then, as I said earlier, Opus 4 Hekaton card was very, very well with Ralban. And so you just, you can do a lot of things with the summons that you have here. But lastly, I wanted to put in a copy of Zodiark in here, not only because of the Camlanaut strategy, but because it also combos very, very well with Tidus. Obviously, if you're taking a lot of damage, you're then and clearing their board at the same time. If you have a Wall and a Tidus out, it doesn't matter what their board is. If you wipe it out and you don't kill yourself, you could kill them that turn. You could just go, okay, Tidus now can't get hit by EX bursts, you now have to deal with me, or you're dead. And it's just as simple as that. So I think that having the combination of Zodiark, Wall, and Tidus is enough to make it worthwhile. So that's it for this video, and this is a deck that I hope you guys are encouraged to go out and have a little play around with, maybe change up a couple of bits to your own needs. But I wanted to kind of highlight the various ways in which this particular deck can deal with ice. I am planning on making a video that generally will allow you to counter every element in the game, not just ice. I think that it's important for people to know how to counter every element in the game, because when obviously a colour gets more popular with new releases, like, you know, fire isn't very popular right now. Who knows, with the release of Opus 6 or anything following it, it could suddenly jump up and be the best colour in the game. Ice could suddenly fall down and be the worst. You never know with these things. So it's very easy to make assumptions based on what we already have, but the best thing to do is to just figure out the best way to counter the meta, and that's something I really want to start teaching people how to do. And speaking of teaching people, another thing that I want to do with these videos is I want to make a boot camp of sorts, because I want to kind of introduce new people to both my channel and to the game itself. So I'm going to be making kind of a beginner's video, which will just be explaining the rules of the game, an advanced video which kind of explains the roles of each colour and the kind of, you know, basic interactions, keywords, things like that, an advanced video, sorry, that was an intermediate video, then an advanced video that it teaches kind of like the relationship of the stack and how that works, and, you know, ways of deck building to kind of counter that, like how many experts you should play, etc. And then an expert one, which will hopefully be explaining like how to cater to a meta, explaining what a meta is, and then, you know, trying to figure out how to research to make your own gameplay better, so that you're not just relying on someone that's, you know, somebody like me. But thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I hope the deck is to your liking. Do subscribe to the channel if you like what you see here, and hopefully we'll have plenty more content for you coming in the near future. So thanks very much again, and I'll speak to you guys soon. See you later.